The final hours before dawn settled quietly over a stone commandery in northern France. Only the wind disturbed the silence, slipping through empty courtyards and narrow corridors where dozens of men still slept, unaware that history was already moving toward them. Then, without warning, a violent pounding echoed through the wooden gates. It came once, then again, louder each time, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble beneath the blows.
Within moments, armed royal soldiers flooded the compound. Doors were forced open, documents were seized, and swords were taken before anyone could think to resist. The brothers demanded answers, but none were given. Some believed the king's men had made a terrible mistake. Others expected the confusion to end before sunset. None of them could possibly know that the same scene was unfolding across France at that exact moment, or that this single morning would become one of the most misunderstood days in medieval history.
The men dragged from their beds that morning were not criminals, rebels, or conspirators. They were members of the Knights Templar, one of the most respected military orders in medieval Europe. For nearly 2 centuries, they had protected Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, fought on the front lines of the Crusades, and earned a reputation for discipline that few armies could match.
But their influence reached far beyond the battlefield. The Templars built a network of commanderies stretching across Europe, managed vast estates, transported enormous sums of wealth, and developed financial practices so advanced that many historians consider them an early form of international banking. Kings trusted them, nobles donated land to them, pilgrims placed their lives, and often their fortunes, in their hands. That is what made the events of October 13th so difficult to understand. If these men had spent generations serving both crown and church, why would an entire kingdom suddenly turn against them in a single morning?
The order to arrest the Knights Templar did not come from an invading army or a foreign ruler. It came from the King of France himself. Philip IV was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, but power came at a cost. Years of warfare, political conflict, and expensive royal ambitions had placed enormous strain on the French crown. The treasury struggled under mounting obligations, and relations with powerful institutions had become increasingly fragile.
Officially, the arrests were justified by accusations of heresy and blasphemy. But historians have debated for centuries whether faith was truly the reason or merely the explanation that made everything else possible.
At the same time, the Knights Templar had grown remarkably wealthy. Their commanderies stretched across Europe, their estates generated steady income, and their financial network handled transactions for nobles, merchants, and even kings. Philip himself had relied on their services in the past. Then, in extraordinary secrecy, sealed orders were sent throughout the kingdom. Royal officials were instructed not to open them until the same appointed morning. Before sunrise on Friday, October 13th, 1307, hundreds of royal agents acted at once.
By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar had become far more than an elite fighting force. They managed hundreds of commanderies across Europe, fertile estates that financed their missions, and maintained supply networks stretching from England to the Eastern Mediterranean. Every new donation, every successful campaign, and every royal privilege strengthened an institution that answered not to kings, but directly to the Pope.
Their reputation for honesty also transformed the way wealth moved across Christendom. A pilgrim could deposit money in one Templar house, travel hundreds of miles, and withdraw the same funds elsewhere using written records rather than carrying bags of silver through dangerous roads.
Nobles trusted them with inheritances. Monarchs entrusted them with state finances. Even royal treasures were sometimes placed under their protection. Yet immense influence often attracts immense suspicion. The very independence that had once made the Templars indispensable also made them difficult for secular rulers to control. If no king stood above them, and they answered only to the church, then one question remained. Who possessed enough authority to decide their fate?
On paper, the Knights Templar answered directly to the Pope. No king possessed the legal authority to dissolve the order or place it on trial for matters of faith. Yet the events unfolding after the arrests quickly tested that principle. Pope Clement V was deeply concerned by the sudden operation carried out across France. Reports arrived describing mass arrests, confiscated property, and accusations unlike anything previously brought against the Templars. At first, he insisted that the Church, not the French crown, held jurisdiction over the order.
That decision changed everything. What began as a royal operation now became a church investigation. The accusations would no longer remain confined to France. They would spread across Christendom. And with every interrogation that followed, the fate of the Templars grew darker. But Philip IV refused to lose control of the investigation. The king publicly promoted the allegations, pressed for swift action, and created political pressure that the papacy found increasingly difficult to resist. Rather than openly confronting the French monarchy, Clement authorized an official church inquiry, hoping to reclaim legal oversight while preventing an even greater conflict between throne and altar.
As the investigations expanded, the accusations grew more extraordinary. Some Templars admitted to denying Christ during secret initiation ceremonies. Others confessed to spitting upon the cross or participating in rituals that shocked even their interrogators. On paper, the evidence appeared overwhelming. Yet the circumstances behind many of those confessions were far more complicated. The investigation that began with sealed royal orders had become one of the largest judicial proceedings of the Middle Ages, and at its center stood one man whose final decision would echo across history. Jacques de Molay had not yet spoken. Under medieval legal practice, certain tribunals permitted the use of torture after specific procedural requirements had been met. In France, a number of Templars were questioned under such conditions. Some later repeated their confessions. Others withdrew them as soon as the immediate pressure had ended. Different kingdoms reached different conclusions, and not every tribunal produced the same results. For modern historians, this distinction matters enormously. A confession may reveal the truth, but it may also reveal the limits of what a person can endure.
For nearly 7 years, the investigation consumed the Knights Templar. Their reputation had collapsed, their properties had been seized, and many of their leaders remained imprisoned. Then, on the 18th of March, 1314, the proceedings reached their final chapter. Jacques de Molay, the order's grandmaster, stood before church officials, expecting to confirm the confession attributed to him. Instead, he did the opposite. Before those gathered, he withdrew his earlier admission and declared the order innocent of the charges for which it had been condemned. Under medieval law, reversing a confession in a case of heresy carried severe consequences.
That same day, Jacques de Molay was condemned as a relapsed heretic and executed by burning on a small island in the Seine. Centuries later, stories would claim that he cursed both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV before his death. Those accounts became part of Templar legend, but contemporary evidence for such a dramatic curse is uncertain. To almost everyone watching in 1314, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Knights Templar were finished. Or so history appeared to say. If the story ended with Jacques de Molay's death, there would be little left to investigate. But history rarely ends so cleanly. The Knights Templar as an institution had already been formally dissolved by papal decree in 1312. Yet dissolving an organization on parchment was very different from erasing thousands of people scattered across an entire continent. Many former Templars were absorbed into other religious or military orders. Some retired quietly after years of service. Others remained under local protection while church authorities determined their future. In several kingdoms, the investigations were less severe than those conducted in France, and many brothers were either acquitted or assigned new roles rather than condemned.
The buildings remained. The farms continued producing food. The roads they had protected did not disappear, nor did the experience, knowledge, and relationships built over nearly 2 centuries. The famous Order of the Knights Templar had come to an end. But the men who had worn the white mantle did not simply vanish. And nowhere was that more evident than in one kingdom on the western edge of Europe. While France dismantled the Templars, Portugal chose a different path. King Denis I recognized that the former Templars had defended his kingdom for generations and managed lands that remained strategically important. Rather than allowing those resources to disappear, he negotiated with the papacy for a new solution. In 1319, Pope John XXII approved the creation of the Order of Christ. Legally, it was a new military order, but many of its members had once worn the white mantle of the Knights Templar. Numerous estates, fortifications, and responsibilities also passed into the new institution, ensuring that valuable experience and infrastructure were not simply abandoned.
Over time, the Order of Christ became deeply connected with Portugal's maritime expansion. Its cross would later appear on the sails of Portuguese ships exploring the Atlantic and beyond, linking the legacy of the medieval crusading orders to the beginning of the Age of Discovery. This was not proof that the Knights Templar secretly continued unchanged. It was something more interesting. History had transformed one institution into another, without erasing the people who carried its knowledge forward. But Portugal was only part of the story.
As the centuries passed, the historical record slowly gave way to legend. One of the most enduring stories claims that surviving Knights Templar escaped to Scotland, where they later fought beside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. It is a compelling tale, but contemporary evidence supporting the presence of a Templar army at the battle has never been found. Most historians regard the story as a much later tradition rather than a documented event.
Similar questions surround Rosslyn Chapel, whose intricate carvings have inspired generations of speculation. While the chapel is undeniably remarkable, direct evidence linking its construction to a secret continuation of the Knights Templar remains absent. The same pattern appears in claims connecting the Templars to modern Freemasonry. Rituals, symbols, and later traditions certainly overlap in fascinating ways. Yet historians generally agree that the strongest documented Masonic connections emerge centuries after the medieval order had been dissolved. So why do these stories continue to thrive? Because history leaves gaps, and wherever evidence grows silent, imagination often begins to speak.
History often prefers simple endings. A famous order is destroyed. Its leaders are executed. The story is over. But the Knights Templar remind us that history is rarely that neat. The arrests of 1307 marked the beginning of their downfall, not their instant disappearance. The order itself was formally dissolved years later. Its final grandmaster met his end in 1314. Yet across Europe, former Templars entered new chapters of life. Their lands found new guardians, and their experience continued shaping the medieval world in ways both visible and subtle.
Over the centuries, facts blended with folklore. Some legends grew from unanswered questions. Others emerged long after the medieval world had passed into memory. Together, they transformed the Knights Templar into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Perhaps that is their true legacy. Not a hidden treasure, not a secret empire, but a story that still challenges us to separate evidence from imagination and to remember that the most fascinating chapters of history are often the ones that resist simple answers. The Knights Templar disappeared more than 700 years ago, but history is filled with mysteries that are just as fascinating. If you enjoyed this investigation, the next story is already waiting. I'll see you there.